I was gonna tell you what I was eating, and then the recording started, so I didn't want to start it off with "It's beef."
It's
What's
beef.
everybody
It's
eating tonight?
beef.
Welcome to week 3. It's beef.
I like beef.
That's funny.
All right, we have a couple
Well,
people who
cool.
are just getting settled from getting home from work and will be on camera shortly, they say.
Sweet.
That sounds
And
good.
I'm on a single screen tonight, so I'm going to do my best to help manage the queue alongside you, Britt, while Ben runs the show.
Yep. Yep. And I guess let's see. Do we want to do a quick overview of the week? I have my spreadsheet. I don't have the flat file, Chris. I guess I can. That doesn't matter, or if you have it handy.
You do not have it handy, but if you want to
Okay.
go through you want to just go through the Excel?
Yeah, I could do that. Just give me
Fine.
1 second here. And then we'll just do a preview of what we got for this week. And then we'll get started. All right. Okay. And really appreciate, by the way, just a quick point of feedback. The I find the discussions that you all are having and the way you're responding to them, significant improvement over the last few weeks. So just wanted to thank you all, like really meaty information. And it's just very rewarding to see how your thinking has evolved and your explanation of how your thinking has evolved. So I just want to commend everybody for taking that feedback and running with it. Um, Really, it's been really interesting reads. And then looked through I think Chris actually graded them, but I went through and looked at the responses to the study guide for this week. And also I was impressed with the level of detail and how you all are answering. So I just wanted to give you all that quick feedback. So really
Excuse me.
quickly, so coming into today, there was a few things you read. I know chapter 10, which was one of my favorite chapters of Chris's book, and also a couple of chapters from the Howl. And then what we'll do today is start to talk about some actual tools that organizational psychologists use and researchers use, particularly around sampling. So we're going to talk a lot today about the history of statistics and why it's generally difficult for human beings. We'll have kind of an open discussion to kick off. We'll talk about statistics in general and start to introduce those topics because next week we're going to get hot and heavy into the real deal numbers and statistics. So we'll start with kind of that elephant in the room. Why are these things so scary to a lot of us? And then we'll also talk about sampling approaches in research, which again, really tactical tool that you're going to use. There's some light reading and some videos over for tonight leading into tomorrow. And then tomorrow, what we'll do and come back is apply some of the things that we talk about tonight in lecture around sampling and collecting different sources of data and data collection. And then we're going to apply those to some vignettes. And so we didn't have a lot of time last week because we took a little bit longer than we anticipated on some other lecture content. Tomorrow, we're going to really try to hone in on those vignettes and spend a good bit of time working together in the lab with your peers, with us, to really get some practice on that. So with that, Tyler, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
So I was but my question is, with the big study guides, are they now going to be like a credit no credit? Because I saw how like this time around it said a survey, and then I got 20 out of 20 when I submitted it. But then last week I noticed how like there were some points taken off. So I just wanted to know like what was going on with that.
Yeah, I can handle that one, Ben, if you don't mind. So essentially, it's just a flip-flop in the way that the points are assigned to it. It's the same number of points, but the way we were doing it, Ben and I had to go through every single question and give you points out of whatever the point total was. The instructional designer flipped it around for us, so now you automatically have all the points, and we're going to read through. And if we want to take points off, we will take points off based on the responses. It was just like an administrative flip, so it reduces the amount of work for Ben and I. Most of y'all across them are are getting 90+ % on most. It's only if we're missing something major from the question that we're taking a few points off. So it was just an administrative switch in the way that the website views the assignment, but it's still credit. It's not a pass fail. It's just we're going to be taking points off as opposed to assigning points. Is that helpful? Cool. All right.
All right, cool. Well, I guess, Chris, any reflections, any thoughts before we dive into our content today from you?
No, the vignettes, like you said, Ben, we read through, we got a lot of good questions from you guys throughout the week. And some of it were like, do we have to go back and do the vignettes again? Should we go back and do the vignettes again? And I'm glad you guys are asking those questions. My response is really, they're going to build on each other as they go. And so I would suggest you go back and do revisit them, because it's going to help you get better grades on the future assignments. And when we get to the end, Ben and I have talked with you guys about potentially getting to drop your lowest vignette of the 4 vignettes and replace it. So I would suggest going and doing that, so that you can get the most out of the exercise. But I did see mostly in the vignette exercise, y'all are getting the major premises, pun intended. But as we go, I think you guys are going to start to refine your understanding of it, and you'll see you can go back and say, oh, now I can go back and I can make this that much better. And that's the difference, I think, if I can opine for a second, between undergrad and grad school, right? In undergrad, you're doing the work they tell you to do. In grad school, you're doing the work you know you need to do this to understand the concept. So I would encourage you guys to go back and do that.
Cool. Well, any thoughts, any questions before we dive in to the content? Anything from the last week that you want to bring up or struggling with or interested in, or any ahas over the week or the weekend? No pressure. Just want to make sure we gave some space for you. Okay. All right, cool. Well, let's dive into the lecture content. And like I mentioned, we're going to start with introduction to statistics and ease our way into this content. And like I mentioned, it's going to get relatively serious starting next week. So let's see. Let me do this so I'm not as dark on the screen. There we go. Okay. All right. So the first thing I'd like to start with just kind of an open question. We're going to talk about this. You're going to watch a quick video in between tonight and tomorrow that'll give you one potential answer to this question. There's no one right answer to this. But this is it's a fairly established trend among human beings pretty generally, that humans aren't that great with probability. And a great example of why or the fact that humans, if you need some proof, casinos. Casinos are unbelievably profitable. They are highly successful and lucrative businesses. And they play on this exact fact that human beings are just generally very bad at probability. And extending that, I remember going through psychology in undergrad, especially, and in graduate school. And I remember when we would come to these courses like this one, where we really were diving very deeply into probability and math and logic, like you were in the last couple of weeks. And a lot of people, I remember, would reflect like, I didn't sign up for this. I came into psychology. I didn't sign up for all this stuff. Like, what are we doing? And so I wanted to raise this as a question to get your thoughts on it, and then also to kind of we'll have some thoughts to close out on it. But let me pause here and just, what are your thoughts on this? Why is it that humans are generally bad at probability? Why is math scary? Why is logic scary?
Well, I would say that humans are notoriously emotional beings. And so it's hard to separate emotion from hard logic and mathematics and probability. Using your casino example, anything that's involved with dopamine and dopamine spikes, usually humans are going to chase after that. And there's not a lot of dopamine involved with mathematics, logic, and probability, because unless you solve a huge math problem that it's been taking you forever to do, but it's kind of like a delayed sense of gratification of sorts. So, oh yes, I'm sorry. I am generally emotional, and I think on some sort of spectrum we fall on the degree of emotionality. I do not get dopamine
Interesting.
from math, so congrats.
That's a really interesting take though, that humans are very emotional as a species, compared to other species, we are indeed highly emotional. That's a good take. Let's see, we itinerary. Yeah, yeah. So Julia, I'd love for you to, or sorry, Julie, I'd love for you to expand on that.
Think a lot of the time, based on how we're feeling, we tend to act on that. So if something feels good, we tend to act on that more versus something that doesn't feel good, or if that kind of makes sense, right? Rather than, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it does. It does. No, those are good takes. Um, any other reasons or examples that you can think of?
How many of you had great experiences in grade school and high school with mathematics?
That's kind of what I was going to say is I think it starts early on with experience and how you've been taught and how you were kind of raised and what that experience was like embedded in you. I think a lot of people didn't have great math teachers, or you had parents that were frustrated with the math. And so it just created this kind of like anxiety and this pre notion of like, I'm just not good at math. So you just kind of stick to that belief that you can't learn it and that you don't know it.
Mm.
It's not the most
Kinda-
inclusive subject in school. I will say that. I didn't like math until my junior year of college. I'm with you, Chelsea.
Mhm. That's a really good take too, because and there was like this tendency, I think sometimes, at least when I was in school, it was kind of the nature versus nurture argument. It was either you're good at it or you're not. It was rarely, especially with the standardized tests. You would take the standardized tests, you get the math score, and it was like, well, some people were built for math and others weren't. And that leads to kind of a defeatist attitude of like, well, if I don't have it, I'm never going to be good at it, so I might as well just not worry about it. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Any others? Well, I won't spoil it completely, but one of my favorite explanations for it is an evolutionary explanation for why humans are bad at math. And so stay tuned. One of the videos, very short video discussion between Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins, that I thought was really interesting. And I want you to watch it for a few reasons. I'll explain why. I want you to watch for the other than addressing this direct issue tomorrow. But I think they talk a little bit about from an evolutionary perspective why that may be the case. And Becca, they also point to the kind of reason you gave around in a way, the emotional side of it or the social side of it. And so that'll be an interesting perspective. I brought this question up to start because one, I wanted to address that issue of, as we are psychologists, we're aspiring psychologists, and sometimes coming into these heavy methods and statistics courses are pretty jarring. And they're jarring for a lot of psych people who are going into psychology when they hit these really tough courses, and it's like this stone wall that you can't get over. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because I want to just acknowledge that you are not, if you're feeling that way, you don't have to out yourself that you're feeling that way. But if you're feeling that way a little bit, it's normal. It's totally normal. And in fact, most people feel the same way. There are some people that don't, but a lot of people feel the same way as you do. And the good news is that you absolutely can get better at this. The other part of it is that the people that you're going to be working with in organizations, your stakeholders, they might be extremely senior people. They might be numbers people. They might have tremendous big business acumen. They might have reputations that they are well-known hardcore business leaders. And that might subtly imply that they understand numbers. That doesn't necessarily mean they understand probability. That doesn't necessarily mean they're strong in math, they're strong in logic. And one of the other reasons I think that that is the case is because math is abstract. And this is one of the other things we know about humans is that if you take a problem or a situation and you put it all of it in a social environment, people are going to perform quite well at figuring out that environment. Oh, yeah, that person's doing that. Put them in a social environment, they can figure out the problem. You take that same problem, you remove the social context from it, and you put it in just numbers, and human performance goes drastically down. And so this is really important for you, not just for yourself as an individual and getting over that hurdle of the fear of this or the discomfort with math or probability or statistics, but it's understanding that the people that you're going to be presenting to, your stakeholders, are likely going to be in the same boat. One of the most dangerous mindsets that a person can have is when they really don't understand this stuff at all, but they think they do. And you're going to run into that a lot in organizational settings, especially among leaders, because oftentimes leaders don't want to share that they're not good at something. And so if they know a little bit, if they've heard of probability theory, if they've heard of various statistical tests, and they remember that, oftentimes they're going to be more confident in their ability to consume that information than they really are able to consume that information. That is extremely important for you as an organizational researcher to understanding your typical audience. And that oftentimes you're going to be working with people that don't understand this stuff well. And so that's basically the reason I wanted to share this was, one, help us get over that hump if we have to get over that ourselves, but also understand who's on the other side of the conversation as we're discussing research, as we're discussing business problems, as we're taking that stated business problem and dissecting it and bringing it down to a hypothesis and then going test that and sharing results. That's who we're going to be dealing with. So we'll start really quickly. One of the really interesting facts, and I just learned this recently, actually, as I was preparing for this course, is that probability and statistics are relatively new fields of mathematics. And again, there's potentially an evolutionary reason for that. Like probability theory is not really that old. It's a couple of 100 years old. And so you can see that there's a variety of different places where statistics and probabilities started to really come online. For example, you might recognize some of these names. We're going to be talking about Gaussian. We're going to be talking about Pearson correlation. So you're going to see some of this stuff where you don't have to understand all the history of where all this came from. But the point is, this is a relatively recent field of mathematics. And there's a very social and potentially evolutionary reason for that. When we dive into statistics, we in this course and really just in general, we're going to be focused on two different types of statistics: descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. And based on the name, you can probably take an immediate stab at what these are. You may already know, be very familiar with these, but basically the names really matter here and they're very explanatory for what it is. So descriptive statistics do exactly what we were talking about a few weeks ago when Chris shared the three different types of analytics: descriptive, predictive, prescriptive. Descriptive statistics are exactly what they sound like. They describe what a distribution of data looks like, or what a data set looks like. What's the center of the distribution? What's a typical response within that data set? And they also go further to talk about how variable are the data points in that data set. How do they differ? Are they pretty tightly? They pretty close? Are they really, really spread out and they vary a lot? And so as an organizational psychologist, what we often want to know is, hey, is that data different than this data over here? Those people who just got that training intervention, are they different? Is that part of a different distribution than the people who didn't get that training intervention? Are they part of the same distribution of data or is it different? We're essentially using measures of descriptive statistics to determine that. And we're also looking at things like, hey, if this data is spread really broadly, then it becomes much more difficult to find a difference between whether that data point was found in this distribution or another distribution. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of us, but descriptive statistics tell us a lot about the sample of data that we're collecting. What they don't do, though, is they don't allow us to make generalizations beyond the data that we've collected. And that's a really important point. That's where we get to inferential statistics, which we're going to get to in a minute. But with descriptives, there's going to be a lot. You may already be well aware of these different measures, this central tendency, mean, median, mode. We're going to talk a lot about that next week, next Monday, and also measures of dispersion or variance, range, variance, standard deviation. But again, the really important thing to remember about descriptive statistics, we're just calculating information about the sample of data that you have, not about a broader population from which that sample comes from. That's where inferential statistics come from. So inferential statistics build on descriptives. They're dependent on descriptives, but they allow us to now infer. We collected this data about some employees, and we don't have all the employees that we want to make inferences about, but we have some of them. And so we're going to run some analyses to determine whether we can make inferences and what inferences and conclusions we can make about the broader group of the population. And that distinction between the sample and the population is going to be a big topic that we talk about in a few minutes. Okay, so let's dive right into that. So when we're talking about descriptive and especially inferential statistics, we naturally run into this issue of, okay, we're collecting samples. We're all somewhat familiar with the idea of collecting samples. We talked a little bit about that. We're going to talk a lot about that later tonight. But also, we have to realize that there are populations of employees. There's populations of data types. There's populations of elements that we're sampling from. And sometimes populations aren't always that easy to identify. It sounds like it's simple. Oh, yeah, it's everybody in that group. It's all employees. That's not always true. And so we're going to actually look at some scenarios where you're going to have to go through and figure out what would the population be in that scenario. And what you'll find is that it's not always as easy as it seems. So let's talk a little bit about the differences there. So population, of course, refers to the entire universe or set of individuals, if we're studying people, or elements. This might be performance data. It might be, I'm trying to think of something that's not human, but it doesn't have to be people as your population, but the entirety of whatever group of things or people that you ultimately want to draw conclusions about or make inferences about. In statistics, the term statistics implies that we're using samples of populations. And that's a really interesting point that a lot of people don't know, is when we're talking about populations, we don't need statistics. If we had all the population data, we would just have all the data. And if we wanted to know if, hey, what's the average age of Americans? And we did the census, we got every American to participate, we could calculate the average age. That's not really statistics. That's just the average age of the population. Statistics implies that we don't have access to the population data, which is mostly the case as organizational researchers. We don't have, and we'll discuss why that's the case later, but we don't have that. And so that's why statistics come in. Statistics implies that we're using samples of data from a broader population. And as you can see, a sample is some sort of subset of that population. So essentially, this is just kind of restating it. We're pulling samples of data from a broader population. But before we go into why populations are so challenging or why are going into different approaches to sampling, I wanted to just quickly discuss this point here. It's sometimes just flat out impossible to access the total population. Sometimes it's impractical, but most of the time when you're working as an organizational psychologist, you may not have full access to the population, which kind of sounds weird, right? Because if you're an organizational psychologist, you're working within inside an organization, And presumably, back to some of the discussions we've had about access to technology and the data that comes out of those technologies and all these different life cycle processes, we should know who our employees are, right? We should know the population of employees. We should know who they are, essentially, different demographics about them. We should have access on their performance. We should have access to their training information. But yet, we're still often using statistics and samples from that population. And so
Hey,
the
Ben.
question I'll put, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Oh, I just want to put in 2 cents there that I think there's a bit of a difference between descriptives and inferentials here, right? Because as an internal practitioner, um, you often do, for the descriptive sake, have access to the whole population. If you're a consultant, you often don't. If you're in other places, you don't. But you usually do have access to the whole organization from the descriptive perspective. I wanted to refine that a little bit because what Dr. Ben is saying is super true in that when we are trying to do intervention measurement, we very rarely do. Because if you've rolled the whole intervention out to the whole company, then you don't really need to do statistics, to Dr. Ben's point. But that's not usually what we do. We usually roll it out to one region or one job code or one part of the organization and then have to infer whether the change that we see would hold, right, if it was rolled out for the rest of the organization. So I just wanted to call that difference out, that oftentimes we do have access to the whole organization or the whole population for the sake of describing the current state or the past state. Where we almost never do is when we're trying to decide whether an intervention or some kind of research is going to actually have the effect we think it will.
And Chris kind of answered part of this question too, which is oftentimes, even if we do have access to the data now, we can describe the data now, but that doesn't mean that that's going to have the same, we're going to see the same value or the same effect as we move forward in time as the external conditions change. And so that was kind of the part of the trick question with this is sometimes we often do have access to the data, but we only have the access to the data right now in that snapshot. And we're trying to often infer, conclude, is that likely to continue? Is that likely to be true when we don't know all these external factors that are gonna come into play into the equation. And so it becomes really, really difficult. And so you might have access today. It might seemingly seem like you have a population of data, but you really don't. And that is why it's not as easy as it seems to identify even what the population is in a lot of cases. So when we get to sampling, one of my favorite examples, and I was just cooking spaghetti tonight, believe it or not, which is kind of, I did not plan that. My wife started putting it on, had to take the kids to basketball, and I was like, oh, we're doing spaghetti tonight. Sweet. Perfect. So this is one of my favorite examples to kind of explain populations and samples. If you were cooking spaghetti like I was earlier today, you start boiling your water, right? You take your spaghetti, you put it in there. And how do you know if the spaghetti is done? Well, you could take every single piece of spaghetti out and try it. And you say, oh, okay, great. That's perfect. All these are soft. So now we can eat, but you just ate off all the spaghetti, right? Or you could take your fork, make sure you're stirring it all there. It's all getting evenly boiling. You take a fork out, say, oh yeah, okay, that's, you try it. Yep, that's good to go. Spaghetti's done. It's a perfect example of sampling. Now, we'll get to kind of random sampling and different types of sampling. But imagine if you put the spaghetti noodles in, but you didn't stir it. And so each noodle and each part of the noodle didn't get an equal chance to boil. And then you take right off the top the semi-hard noodles and you conclude, oh, these are not done. But the noodles way at the bottom are well done, and they're starting to fall apart, right? So this is a perfect analogy to kind of keep in your mind as you think about sampling and giving people in the population an equal chance to be selected, and why that's important to determining whether that's a good sample. So that's what we're going to get into in a little bit. But let's apply it to HR. And I just wanted to provide you just a couple of realistic examples of where we might see this play out, as if we were wanting to study job satisfaction of all employees in the company, and we wanted to survey a selected group of 1,000 employees. Maybe we don't have the budget to go and survey everybody in the company, perhaps. Maybe we have an opportunity to survey 1,000. And so using statistics, we might be able to infer what the level of job satisfaction is in the population of employees at the company by just sampling 1,000 people, if we do the sampling correctly. If you're getting ready for election season and you watch the polling on the news, this is exactly the type of stuff that they're doing. We talked about the Dewey Truman example a while back and how bad sampling can create erroneous inferences about the population if you're not sampling a representative sample. Studying the average work hours of managers based on collected data collected from only 200. Assessing the training needs of a company's entire staff by analyzing feedback from 250 employees who participate in training programs. So these are legitimate examples of a place where an organizational researcher might do a simple sampling approach or use a sample to infer the effectiveness of something in the population. Couple of other scenarios, and this is where I'd love to break everybody out into pairs and spend a few minutes dissecting each of these scenarios. And specifically, what I'd love for you each to do, each of your pairs to do, is look at each of the 3 scenarios and try to identify what the population could be. What's the ideal population? What population of people would you be trying to target in each of these scenarios? Now, what you will find is that there's not one single right answer. We didn't give you enough information to determine that. So what I'd like you to do is point out, what questions would you need to ask? What would you want to ask that talent acquisition person, the talent management professional, the employee experience professional, to identify what the actual population would be, but also take a stab at it. If you want to take a stab at it, what you think it could be based on the context, and include what assumptions you might make and what questions you might ask, that's perfect. So again, I just want to restate, take these, try to take a stab at what do you think the population could be, include any assumptions, include questions you would want to ask to help you get to that conclusion as to what the population is. And keep in mind, there isn't one single right answer for each of these. So before we break out into groups, does that make sense? Any questions on this quick exercise?
Just to clarify, so we're just identifying the ideal population and then any questions that would possibly lead us to making sure that's the right population.
Correct. That's right. And any assumptions you make. So if you want to take a stab and say, I think in this case, this is probably what the population is, and I'm assuming this, this, and this, that's fine too.
And how much time for this?
10 and 10. 10 minutes in a group, and then we'll come back and discuss for 10.
And
Sorry,
just
my
to
short hand
clarify-
up here. That's what that means.
And just to clarify, Ben, we're doing groups of 2.
Yeah, let's do groups of 2. Let's do pairs.
Okay, awesome. There's going to be one group of 3 just because we're an odd number,
Cool.
but we're ready to roll.
Okay. And let's see, can we leave these? How do we make sure everybody has access to these while they're in their groups?
Has access to,
The little examples.
Maybe put the screen up and let people screen cap it.
Yeah, you
I
can
took
take
a
screen
screenshot and put it
screenshot.
into
Yeah.
the chat. If that's
yeah, that would be best is for
Perfect.
people to
Let's see
take
if
a
I can do
screenshot
that.
or take a picture on their phone or any number of those things.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's see. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Becca. That's perfect. Okay, cool. Everybody got it? All right. Well, we'll see you back in 10.
Okay, 10 minutes. And great, going now. Bye, guys. It's so fun.
Recording in
Speaking,
progress.
speaking of PSYOP, are you guys planning to go this year?
I will be there.
Yeah, Chris?
I am probably 80% in, yeah.
Okay, that's really exciting. Okay, good, good. We missed you last year, Chris.
Yeah, I was disappointed, but Qualtrics puts on a heck of an event as well, and they're like right on top of each other typically. And if you're
Mhm.
Ben, you get to go to both. But if you work for a company that's not a vendor at the event, you usually have to pick one or the other.
I see. Valid. Okay, well, looking forward to it. Good question,
right.
Tyler. You're welcome to go. I'm still talking to Ben Wood about whether or not the program can help with your admission to the conference, but we haven't determined that yet.
I find if you get research published, it tends to be a really good motivator for the university to send you. Just saying for next year.
It's true.
And if you have thesis ideas.
It's a really
Very
incredible
true.
experience for networking and learning. My first year going was last year and I loved it. It's so much fun. So I'm really looking forward to going again this year.
True
I'll
story.
put
It's
the-
how I got my first.
Relatively
It's
true.
how I first
Yeah.
my first IO job was. I got my master's thesis published at PSYOP. The school was willing to buy me a plane ticket because I couldn't afford to go on my own, and I met my first boss at PepsiCo there. So it's worth it.
I would echo
What was
that.
your thesis on?
Person environment fit, how organizational culture, how the big 5 personality traits predict job satisfaction across a variety of different corporate cultures. I'll send you the paper if you want.
Love it.
Yep. And I keep saying Toto. Yes, I am a Toto fan, but also too, it is a great networking place, and they even have a job, a place where you can like put your information in, and you can go and even interview and just network and talk. You can get mentoring. There's a mentoring section. I used to be a mentor there. Well worth it. You get to meet practitioners who've been in the space for a long time. So even just not for the sessions, but just for the networking, it's a really, really worth it. And I got my first real IO job, same story as Chris, by being at PSYOP, and I had all sorts of internship interviews, and then one of them was Ashley Walford, who Chris and I both worked for a number of years. So there you go. There's our sales pitch for PSYOP. Okay,
Love it.
so would love to hear from the group on these scenarios. We had the talent acquisition, talent management, employee experience. Let me flash those up really quickly, and would love to hear how you all broke this down and what you found. What were the populations you came up with and why? Who wants to go first?
I think identifying the populations was pretty tough without asking the right questions first. So there was like the talent acquisition, what do they mean by diverse? So kind of what is their operational definition by that? Are we looking at diversity by roles, by compensation,
Mhm.
by experience? We also kind of looked at like, are we competitive in the pay? Is maybe that why we're struggling with offer acceptance rates. So there was a couple questions that we felt like, before we settled on a population size or a sample size, we'd need to ask certain questions first.
Mm-hmm. You nailed that the first part. What's the operational definition of diverse hire? Perfect. And going through the different examples you gave, what does that mean? Is it diversity of experience? Is it demographic diversity? How does the organization define that? And if you are working in HR at a company, sometimes that term diverse hire does automatically have an operational definition. There's a definition around it, and usually that might be people of protected classes. But that doesn't have to be the case. And that may not have been the case in this situation. So you're exactly right, in my opinion. Chelsea, this one absolutely requires a number of questions and to get to that operational definition about what this company meant by diverse hires. Any others on this one? Sorry, I'm going to pop open the chat here too. Any other thoughts on this particular scenario before we move
For
on?
this one, would it be okay with the limited information that we have for the actual sample? Would it be okay to say the candidates that we're either getting to the final rounds of interviews or the people that we're extending offers to, just because
good catch.
the accepted offers I feel like might be skewed to something we can't control, such as compensation, all the other life factors that make someone accept a job?
Another great point, Tyler. And I think what I would highlight is your point around when we're talking in this scenario, it's not just about diverse hires, it's about where they are in the recruitment funnel. And if we're talking about offer acceptance rates, we're talking about people that got pretty late in the funnel. They got a job offer. And there's a lot of people that came before that who might have been labeled as diverse hires, but we're not talking about them. We're talking about those who got the offer and decided to reject it. That's a great catch, Tyler. So yeah, I think that's exactly both of these responses. This is exactly the type of dissection that you have to do in a scenario like this to get down to, well, what does that mean? What is the population we're talking about? What does it mean, diverse hire? Where are they in that hiring funnel? Yeah, well done. Any other thoughts on this one? Okay, what about the second? What about the talent management scenario?
Mariah and I were talking about this one, and we were thinking of potentially the population could be current leaders and high performing talent in terms of understanding what is currently required, what are the weaknesses, where are the pain points, in terms of assessing that, but then asking deep, like more questions, get more information would be, what kind of report are you looking to run? What have you tried in the past? What's your plan for building bench strength? How are you trying to build bench strength? So just trying to understand the parameters, but my mind first goes to like, what are the current leaders doing? What are the current strengths, weaknesses, pain points that leaders see? And then going and actually talking to the hypo and seeing, where are they at? And then kind of seeing the difference between. So.
And I like where y'all took it. Y'all kind of took it further than that of trying to solve the problem. And I think you pointed out some really good points and considerations and questions you would want to ask. But I guess my question would come back to, well, who are we talking about here? Who's the population in this case? And so I'm curious how you thought about that question. Like, who are we trying to focus on here?
Yeah, I think where our head was at was the high performing talent is really, if you're trying to build the bench strength for future leadership, the high performing talent or the high potential talent is what's going to become the future leaders. So that's why my idea of population was, who are the current leaders? They've already been there, and then who are our potentials, and what's the difference between those two populations? If we get current state and ideal state, the high potential is not been fully developed. They're still malleable towards that future state. What are leaders doing now that's really great, really strong? What are leaders doing now that are potential weak spots? What do leaders see as pain points in their leadership, or whatever that may be? How can we address that? And then let's see where high potentials are, where they feel their strengths are, weaknesses, and then figure out if there's common ground between the two answers. But we also need to know how they're trying to bench. So that's kind of how we were thinking about it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good clarification there. Let's see. Bailey, go ahead.
I was just gonna say what I put and let me know if I'm on the right page or not. But I put for the employees, obviously, like high potential. I kind of did leaders/employees who have been there for a while. And the questions: what employees work the hardest? What is the average amount of years employees have been here for? Who exhibits leadership skills? what employees
Mm.
are up for a promotion, stuff like that.
Right, right. Okay. So I love where both of you take it slightly different directions. And so I think in your clarification, Becky, you pointed out a really good thing is that to solve this problem, we may actually have to understand two different populations, two related but different populations. First, the population of hypos. How do we define hypos? Goes back to Chelsea's point about what's the operational definition of hypo? You don't have enough information in the scenario to do that. So you have to dig for that. What do we mean by high potential? How do we measure high potential? Is that part of how we do we identify it through the performance review? Do we go through some exercise like a 9-box, if you're familiar with a 9-box, to determine whether they're high potential? How is that measured and defined? And then to Becca's point, it could also be, if you kind of go further here, it could be helpful to understand the population of existing leaders who are really good at their job. Maybe that's a separate population to help us define what those skills and abilities are. And so, Bailey, you brought up some additional points about how we have to dig a little deeper. So, for each of these, hopefully, what's clear is identifying what the key population is not always easy on the surface, much like we had to do with the problem statements and breaking them down in the premises. We have to really break these things down into what's the definition? How are we measuring it? How are we determining who's hypo or not? How are we determining who's a diverse candidate in terms of how the organization defines it? And so the last one's very similar. Well, in a way, it's similar, but I'm curious, anybody take a stab at this third one?
I mean, I think it just came down to the questions again on like, okay, what is the employee journey? Like
Mm-hmm.
what stage is that of the employee life? Are you even talking about the employee life cycle? Are you talking about employee experience? And then also like it's the global head of employee experience. So what
Mm,
what are you looking at from a global standpoint? What regions are you focusing on?
mm-hmm.
So that was some of our questions.
Yep. Yeah,
I
good
did
take.
want to add one question to that is
Sure.
if it is going to depend on your role, what your journey looks like. Like if it's job specific
Mhm.
journeys.
Yep. Yep. Because journeys do differ by job and they could differ by region, location. So yeah, you're all pointing out great points. Because again, in this one, we don't have enough information, but we have an added variable of one, well, what employees are we talking about? Are we talking about employees in certain roles and jobs, like you pointed out, Tyler? Are we talking about every employee in the organization? Are we talking about, high volume positions? What jobs are we talking about? And then we also have to define the other part, which is what about the journey? And we call it the defined employee journey, but it's not explained here. So we have to further dig into that because that's part of defining the population. If we're talking about all people in retail sales, for example, at what is considered the employee journey. And so again, these were not meant to stump you or to trick you, but really to give you some practice in digging in and identifying and seeing, one, how difficult sometimes it is to identify even what the population is. While that might seem seemingly simple, it's not always that simple. And two, that you have to really think about, and I love the inclusion of the operational definition here, of what that operational definition is. How are we measuring that and defining that? Because again, it's sometimes not very clear. So any closing thoughts, Chris, any thoughts from you before we move on?
Yeah, you kind of answered a question I was going to ask the class, which is, what does this conversation sound like? And it sounds like the logical argumentation practice we were doing 2 weeks ago, right? Everything is a discussion of premises and conclusions, right? It's all sort of just this fractal conglomeration of, okay, you said high potential. What do you mean by that? Okay, you told me what you meant by high potential, but what do you mean by that? Right? And when we're trying to ascertain anything from what are the premises and conclusions in the problem statement, to how are we defining our populations, to how are we defining our variables, you're going to find yourself in this kind of recursive process of constantly challenging your own assumptions of your premises and helping your customers understand their own assumptions that they may or may not be comfortable understanding or wanting to talk about. But they're important in order to create clarity, which is a practical thing, and they're important to create validity, right? Which is what's going to make your work effective. So always be challenging what you think you know or what you think, because you're always going to find that there's another layer of assumption.
Always be challenging, kind of like that. That's a new definition of ABCs. When I was in pre-sales, we used to say ABC, always be closing. So if you're a scientist, always be challenging. I like it. Stealing that one, Chris. All right, really quickly. This was a good point to introduce this. We're going to introduce this again. But again, when we talk about statistics, we're talking really about samples. And when we have populations, instead of talking about statistics, we talk about parameters. And if you've never seen this before, this is an important thing as you do some of the reading going into next week and actually even this week a little bit. You're going to notice that sometimes there's a use of English letters to describe different statistics, like X bar or S, the standard for standard deviation, lowercase n for the sample size. You'll see all that to the right. But then you might also run into some Greek letters. And if you remember undergraduate stats, you might remember what some of those mean. But generally speaking, when you run into a Greek letter, that usually will represent a population parameter. We're talking about a characteristic or a data point that describes the nature or the shape of the distribution of a population. And you can see like mu for the mean, X bar for the sample, mu for the population, X bar for the sample. So this is just kind of a reminder. We'll bring this back up again next week. You'll bring it back. We'll see it again in week 5. But just a reminder, when you see those Greek letters, that's a pretty good indication that they're talking about some population parameters. And then when you see the English letters, we're talking about sample statistics. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this section, and we will now move into sampling. And again, this is one of the most useful and practical tools of a researcher, an organizational researcher, and really important. So far, we've talked about a lot of theoretical stuff. This is going to get really practical today. So hopefully that'll be a little bit refreshing for you all. So let's talk a little bit about sampling and different approaches to sampling. But essentially, what we're doing in sampling is quite simple. We're taking a subset, a small set of people or a small set of elements from a broader population to analyze them. Oftentimes we'll do this because it's easy to access, it's more accessible, it's often cheaper, because you will find once you get into, those of you who are working in an org right now, Chelsea, Julie, I'm sure you can appreciate the hindrance of, hey, we don't have the budget to go do that right now. So, hey, we'd like to do a study on the workforce. I'm sure you would, but do you have the money to do that? And oftentimes the answer is no. Or Chris, I'd be curious from your perspective with how many employees does Amazon have total? Is it what?
1.6 million.
Yeah. So how often are y'all doing studies of the entire population of 1.6 million employees at Amazon?
Not often. We have to get creative with our research methods.
Yep. That's a huge population of employees. But really what we're doing, and this is especially true as we move into inferential statistics, when we are sampling, what we're trying to do as a researcher, really one of the ultimate goals of a researcher when we're doing sampling, is to get a sample that we can feel confident that we're making a good inference or conclusion about the population. That's really what we're trying to do. And the ability for us to do that is really dependent on this third box here. We're trying to get a couple of things in our samples: generalizability, representativeness, but we also have to balance the practicality of sampling. And in a lot of cases, we're going to talk a lot about random sampling. We're going to talk about a variation of that called stratified random sampling. And these are great tools. These are what we often ideally want to do, but sometimes they're just not practical. And so we have to deal with what we have. So we're going to talk a little bit about both. We're going to talk about the ideal state and what we're trying to aim for and why. We're also going to talk about when you can't do that, what do you do? The other part that I'd like you to, as we go through this content, we have the discussions, don't just think about it from your perspective as a researcher, but think about it from the perspective of you as a consumer of research. So when you log into your phone in the morning and you start reading the news and it talks about a new research study or whatever, all that stuff that pops up on your social media that talks about, studies that were conducted, looking at actual academic studies, and how do you look for characteristics of the representativeness? How do you look for generalizability in the samples? How do you determine whether hey, they used a good sampling approach and therefore I have a little bit more confidence? So also think about this as a consumer of data, because your ability to consume data will help you build those background theories, will help you gain those insights that are going to accompany the research that you're doing in the organization that you're working for.
Hey, Ben,
Yes.
this might be a bold statement, but I'm interested if you agree with me or not. I would go so far as to say is there's never been a psychological study conducted that doesn't have generalizability limitations. So it's less about knowing whether the study can be generalized or not, and more understanding where can it not be general, right? Typically, at the very least, you have cultural, so it doesn't go worldwide. Typically, participants are usually from a individual country. Sometimes they're from many, but that's rarer. Oftentimes, it's a convenience sample, like a bunch of graduate students,
Yeah.
or
talk
a
about
bunch
that in a
of
bit.
kids in high school, or children aged 7 to 12. So I would go so far as to say it's not about finding whether there's generalizability issues. It's about figuring out what they are and what those constraints are and where you can and can't apply these results.
I think that's a fair point. And maybe this is a good place to pause with a group to make sure that we have a good understanding of some of these terms. So what is, to you all kind of listening to this, what does generalizability mean? What
And
does
we
it
just read
mean for that to be
chapter,
generalizable?
and if you could use an example from chapter 10, which you just read, there's a fantastic lack of generalizability example from science in chapter 10.
Who can explain generalizability?
I'll take a stab at it. So generalizability is the way that you can justify using a sample to draw a generalization about that larger population. So like looking at a group of first graders, being able to use only just a few of those first graders to then make that's not a good one. Oh, people in the military. Let's use the Army branch. They all have a gung ho aspect to them, and like being able to Air Force, I know a little bit more. They all have this superiority feeling towards the other branches. So because you've met a few of them in that sample, you can kind of make that generalization that I think that Air Force feel like they're better because of the premises of, hey, we think we're better because we get taken care of better, we're flying, we have all these other amenities that make us better. So just being able to take that and then apply that to the larger population.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, you explained the gist of it, I think, Tyler, which is, we're drawing some conclusion based on the data we have. And, we're making some observation, we're making some measurement, we come to a conclusion about that, and then we are generalizing it to a bigger group. And
Then I
Chris,
forgot to then, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You also need to be able to have equal representation. So everyone in that population needs to be able to be selected should that come up, like as the sample person.
Yeah, and that gets us to the random approach. Yeah, good add, Tyler. So
I'm
Chris,
gonna pick on a
yeah, go
particular
ahead.
word you said there, Tyler, that's important. It's not equal. And I'm going back to my grad stat class where I got points off for saying even distribution when I meant normal distribution. It's not about equal typically, it's about representative, right? And I know that sounds like a very pedantic thing to bring up, but in this juncture, it's very applicable. It's not about having equal representation at your sample. It's about having comparable representation in your sample.
Hmm.
You want your
Can
sample
you
to
explain what
look
you mean
like
by
your population, and that's probably what you meant. But I'm picking on it particularly because a lot of times in practical application, we'll say even or equal when we mean generalizable or representative. And you need to train yourself about what the difference is.
Let's use an example. Would be like, for example, if you had, let's take the Air Force example you had, Tyler, and you, let's say for sake of argument, 80% of those enlisted in the Air Force were identify as men, and 20% identify as female. And so what you would do in that is you wouldn't have equal representation of females and males in the sample, because if you did, you would oversample females. And then that sample would not necessarily be representative of the distribution of males and females in the population. As a really simple example. So Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's kind of the point you're making with the two words.
Yeah, and when we get into the nitty-gritty of statistics, words like even and equal and normal and representative and generalizable are going to come up a lot. And part of what you have to do is train yourself to use the word that you mean to define the effect that you're talking about. Because as a practitioner, you're going to find yourself using and correcting in a tactful way, but helping your customers understand the difference between these things, right? Especially with stratified random sampling, which Dr. Ben will get into, is one of the most common forms of sampling you do in applied life, because you have to build a sample that represents your population.
Right.
But that doesn't mean having men and women be equal necessarily if the job code you're looking at is 90%, right? It's about creating representation that's comparable to the job market or the organization or whatever thing that you're studying. So I didn't mean to pick on you specifically, Tyler, but it was a really good moment for us to talk about that concept and how important it is.
And it's not that dissimilar to the logic around a lot of companies' diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging strategies, right? And the argument that they make about it is, well, we want our workforce to represent the population that we are doing business in. That's essentially representativeness. We want our population to be oh, here we go.
I have a fantastic real example of this from the real world. At a company that I was in, corporate set these goals to be in our STEM fields, to be 50% female and 50% and 30% African American by X date. And we had to go back to those senior leaders after they had rolled this to a very significant population communication wide and say, the talent market isn't 50% female. There's no way to get 50% female software development engineers. This was a longer time ago when there were even fewer female engineers than there are now. And we had to explain to them is that you mistook the population of humans for the population of STEM professionals. You can't hit a 50% female goal if you don't have a 50% female talent market. And it took a while for us to explain that to them, but that's a very real example of not understanding the population properly, and then making a goal that was entirely unrealistic as a result.
Okay, so let's get into some of the characteristics of sampling and some of the tools for your toolbox. So we talked a little bit about random, and I think one of the things I picked up, or what you were saying earlier, Tyler, is random sampling, and this is maybe where you can use that word of equal. Random sampling means that you are sampling in a way that everyone in the population has essentially an equal chance of being included in the sample. That's essentially what random sampling means. Doesn't mean that everybody's going to be included, obviously, because we're taking a sample, but you are giving each individual in the sample an equal chance to be included in the sample. And what that tends to do is wash away, or it doesn't always do this, to be clear. We sometimes have to test for this. But what it essentially does is it washes away those third variables that could explain the spurious correlations. We talked about that last week, right? So random sample helps to kind of level the playing field. If we're looking at the relationship between employee satisfaction and job performance, and we're taking a sample, well, there's a lot of factors that could drive job performance, all sorts of things, right? The experience people have, how many years they've been doing the work, what job title they have, all sorts of factors. But we don't care about any of that stuff. What we want to know is, does job satisfaction correlate with job performance? And so random sampling allows us to make some assumptions about, well, we're probably not selecting a bunch of people who all tend to be in a higher job market or a job class that would correlate with job performance. So it helps to wash away those other third characteristics. But to be really clear, it does not guarantee that, because again, it is absolutely possible to, just by chance, select all the people that just happen to go through this training course, and they get randomly selected. Those back to Chris's example last week that he talked about in the book with the shuffling and the music. So it is important. It doesn't guarantee that, but it helps us to feel good about, and we can test the differences between the groups, feel good about the fact that it's not likely that other factors are going to be at play in explaining the relationship between those two variables. Random sampling is one of the most powerful tools that you can use as an organizational researcher.
The larger the population, the less likely it is that you're going to end up with the shuffle problem. The thing that made the shuffle problem was there was so many observations, right? Millions of customers listening to tens of millions of songs. You were bound to get Taylor Swift 8 times in a row, a couple of times, right? It's one of the importance of having power in your sample, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So more observations, more participants, and not oversampling your population. I'm not sure if we're going to get to that, Ben, but a sample can get too big.
Not a ton.
And that can cause some math problems. But for the sake of our conversation here, the short answer to your question, Chelsea, is yes. But we'll leave it at that for now.
Mallory, go ahead.
How do you get around when someone doesn't want to participate that was selected? And then you throw them back in? Do they have the another equal opportunity of being picked, or did they like get they don't include themselves again?
Yeah, that's a good ethical challenge. I think generally you can't force people into a sample in most cases. Usually you can't force them in. And so it would depend on the situation whether you would sample with replacement. That's sometimes called sample with replacement and sample without replacement, meaning that sometimes what we'll do is we'll take a sample, and this is actually pretty common in survey research, where we'll run it. I don't, by the way, I don't think this is a good practice, but some companies do this, and we support it. They'll run like anniversary surveys. So every employee gets a survey, or that's a bad one, a random sample of 1/12 of the population every month. I've seen that before. And so what happens is you would do what's called sample without replacement, meaning that we don't want Mallory and Chelsea and LaRue to survey multiple times. We just want them to survey once. So we sample them. You get a sample. If you're selected in the sample, you opt in. And then if you take the survey, great. You're not going to get asked again till next year. If you don't, we might do the same thing. You're out of the pool now because we're only going to ask you once. Or you could replace those people back in the sample and do a truly random sample. So if you do sampling without replacement where you pull them out, that's not, as you get on, that's not really random anymore. And so to do true random sampling, you have to put them back in the pool to randomly select them. But then to Chris's point, if you have a relatively small population, you might have 3 or 4 people respond to the survey, and that's not really what you wanted. So it does get tricky when you do that, but from an ethical standpoint, generally you can't force people to respond or to participate if they don't want to. And you're right, whoever, let's see who put this. True random samples are pretty rare. Because you run into some of these ethical dilemmas, because you can't force people to participate, especially if you have to collect data from them. And so what we'll talk about a variation called stratified random sampling, which is a great tool. I use this all the time, and we'll explain what it means in a little bit. But as we talked about, it's not really, the random sample is great, but that's not really the end all be all, right? It's not. If you said, oh, my sample's random, that what that communicates is that something else is likely. And it's more likely that your sample is representative. You have better faith that your sample is representative. It doesn't guarantee it, but you have a little bit more faith that it's representative. And you start to have more faith that you're washing out some of those other explanatory variables that might cause or might lead you to a spurious correlation. So the representativeness of the sample is really the characteristic that's critical to understand, not necessarily that it's random. Random helps us get to that point, but the representativeness of the sample is really what's crucial to be able to make an inference about the broader population with a smaller set of data. Okay, so I'm going to skip past this really quickly because I think we talked about it a good bit.
Hey, Ben,
Yes.
I'd like to say one thing real quick. I'm not sure we're gonna get into latent factors because that's a little bit probably too much, but
Probably not.
no, but I do want to kind of nod to it a little bit that when we're talking about the characteristics of our population, there are things we can see and things we can't see. We can measure things like job code and age and gender and things like that. And when we're trying to create representation, we can mark those things down in ones and zeros. And we can create stratified random samples around anything that we can measure. But the reason random as is possible is important is because we can't write it all down, right? And the name for that in statistics is latent characteristics, right? They're things that we can't measure, so we kind of have to infer them. But they can still mess around with how your data comes up. And those can be things like, how was your mood today? Are you an extrovert? Right? There are things that may mess around with the way that you test when you're doing this kind of work. And I just wanted to call out that both of those kinds of things exist. And randomization is great, but if you can measure it, you can control for it in a stratified sample. It's really the things that we can't measure, which is what makes randomization so important.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I threw hopefully a relatable example in the chat of a latent variable would be things like we know that they're real, right? Or we think that they're real, that we know we see the effects of them, but we can't actually go into, Stewart's head and find the engagement neuron. We can't do that. But what we know is that we can capture and get a pretty good idea of whether Stewart's engaged based on how he thinks, what he says, what he does. And that's a perfect example of a latent variable. If you hear that, that's a good example. And that's a great point, Chris. I had not thought about that actually. So we talked a little bit about the representativeness of the sample. You can kind of see some of those things here. They really affect that generalizability. Again, the point that if we are, how much are we able to generalize the finding that we get in our statistics or our tests to a bigger group? Let me move here. So I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite approaches to sampling, which is called stratified random sampling. So it is a variation of random sampling. Again, the key behind random sampling is that every individual or every element, whatever you're measuring, in the population that you defined has an equal opportunity to be included in the sample. And so what a stratified random sampling does is it takes it down a level and says, okay, well, back to that point of representativeness, and actually the Air Force example we use is a perfect one, where we know that if we looked at the population of Air Force cadets or enlisted soldiers, that it's gonna be skewed toward men. There's gonna be much more men in the Air Force than there are women today. But what we might want to do is, in that case, and we also might find that if we further break down the different groups of the Air Force, you look at, let's say, I don't know the Air Force well, you might have to help me, Tyler, but different, you got the airmen, you have the operations folks. I'm totally making this up, but you have different departments or functions within the Air Force, and each of those has a different breakdown. So in some of those, there might be 50-50 men and women. In others, it might be 90-10. In others, there might be 80% women and 20% men. So just using that one demographic variable across those different departments, you might find that there's a very different makeup of people across those. So we have a couple choices. One is we could simply do a random sample of anyone in the Air Force. We could totally do that, right? Let's say we had the money, we had the budget, we had the okay to do it. We did a full-blown random sample, make sure that everybody's included, or everybody has an equal chance to be included. But then let's say one of the requirements of your project is each department head wants a readout for each of their departments. And what if by doing a random sample, we totally excluded people in operations just by chance? Nobody from operations was selected. Well, guess what? One of your stakeholders is pretty annoyed with you because they're not getting a readout in operations. And so that's the point of stratified random sampling, is what we do is we take meaningful strata, or really just different types of groups, and we say, we know going in that we need to have a readout for the West, the East, the South, and the North. Each of those has a total head count of employees. And what we're going to do is we're going to randomly sample within each of those groups. Randomly select a certain amount of people within the South, within the North, within the West, within the East. And so we're going to create those random samples by breaking them down into groups or strata. And so this is a really, really effective approach. We used to use this, we use it all the time. When we know we're doing a sample for a particular survey that we're about to roll out for a customer, and one of the questions we always ask here is, who are you going to be reporting these results to? Who needs to have a report? Who's going to be consuming this information? And once we identify who those business leaders are, that gives us a hint as to, do we need to create strata, and what strata do we need to create from which to conduct random samples? So let me see. Yeah, you're right, Tyler. Ops does get the short end a lot of times.
I want to give an example outside of the survey industry that's also critical. When you're trying to create a sample about an organization, you want to look for representation, but you also want to make sure that the voices are being amplified that need to be amplified. So in big companies that have lots of frontline workers and tons of turnover, typically 60 to sometimes 80% of the population have been with the company less than a year. Now, those 20% that have been with the company for a really long time are your glue. They're the people that are doing most of the work. They are your managers. If I did a random sample of my whole organization, what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to over amplify the voice of the new hire population because they're 60 to 80%. So randomly, they're probably going to be 60 to 80% of my results. And that's whether I'm putting an intervention in or asking a survey, it doesn't really matter what. But in that case, I might make a decision to use a stratified random sample and say, I'm going to use tenure as an important part of my sample, and I'm going to make sure that the 1 to 3 years and the 5 to 7 years and the 10 plus years and the 0 to 1 years get equal voice in this survey or in this condition, experimental condition. So sometimes you almost deliberately change your representation depending on what question you're trying to ask. So that's just another example of a place where you might want to understand the research question and understand what's going to happen depending on how you design your sample.
And yeah, Chelsea, in that scenario, the tenure would be the strata. That's exactly right. Exactly. And at this, what Chris does, that's a great example, Chris. That is also very common in the work we would do around DE&I, is making sure that we're, in some cases, we're actually intentionally oversampling people who might be underrepresented in the population. And so that's kind of a, depending on the purpose of the research, that may make it less generalizable to a broader population outside of the organization. But let's say you have a very small sample of people who identify as Alaska Native American or a Pacific Islander. But that population of people is really critical to get their voice from because they're a critical subgroup of your diverse talent as your company defines it. You might intentionally oversample that group to make sure that you're capturing enough data. Because again, to Chris's point, if you randomly sampled, you might not get any of them participating, and then you lose that critical voice. So in DEI research, sometimes we intentionally will oversample some of those groups in those strata. Becca.
Just curious about like anonymousness. I'm not gonna try to say that word.
Anonymity. Yeah.
Anonymity, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that because that's especially a concern at my job, is people are really wary of surveys and data being gathered on their feedback. And so does stratified random sampling of this sort, when you have underrepresented voices that need to be maybe over amplified in order to get that perspective, how does that how do you account for, and no, not going to say it, how are you going to account for that if you if you have that concern?
I might take it in a slightly different direction, Becca, and this is not like critical coursework, but there's a difference between, and this is a really important difference between anonymity and confidentiality. And anonymity really means like we have no idea who you are. We don't know. All we know is the data you gave us. But what happens when we oh, that's a good one, a Nemo moment. Well done. You win your points back. That was good. When you have your completely anonymous data, right? If let's say we collect survey data and it's completely anonymous, we are very limited in what we can do with that information because we don't have any of those identifiers to connect it to other data with. And so that's where confidentiality comes into play. And so for the most part, most surveys that are run in organizations today are not completely anonymous. They're actually just confidential, which means that we may not be able to tie the responses back to Becca or Bailey or Tyler or LaRue, but we know characteristics of them where we could connect. We have that unique identifier. We have that key. We can connect it to other data points. So I might not be answering your question directly, Becca. There's different approaches we can use to help make people feel very comfortable about the confidentiality, that nobody's going to know who you are. Nobody's going to go hunt you down and find, that you said this. They're not, your name's going to be removed from that. But the confidentiality gives us the power to connect that data to other data sources. Whereas an anonymity, if it's completely anonymous, we lose that ability. So I'm a big fan of confidentiality over anonymity in most cases.
I would say in almost all applied cases, confidential and anonymous are actually legal distinctions. And having a truly anonymous survey is a legal risk typically, especially if you have any sort of open-ended response in your survey.
Mm-hmm.
Because if somebody can write something that's potentially dangerous or a threat or something that's concerning to specifically the physical safety of your employee population, and you can't figure out who it is, then you have a legal problem because now you know something and you can't act on it. So in almost all cases, at least as a practitioner, as an internal person, I always recommend confidential, not anonymous, with a very strict
Yes.
understanding that explains, look, the people that are going to make decisions about this data are not going to know who answered the data. But a very small group of protected people who have no influence over what happens with the survey results have to know, right? But that legally makes it confidential, not anonymous. And this is a rabbit hole we don't want to go super far down,
Yeah.
but always lean towards confidential if you can.
Yes.
You need to garner trust with your people so that they don't feel like
Yes.
they'll be retaliated against. But truly, truly anonymous data, to Ben's point, is hamstrung because you can't connect it to anything else. And it's also a legitimate legal risk. And so it's not something you really want to do,
It's a
typically.
great ad. Yeah. Big takeaway, confidential data collection versus anonymous. Go with confidential if you can. Running a little bit short on time, and there's an exercise I'd like us to go through before we close out. So I'm going to speed through a little bit of this. This is just a couple of examples of stratified random sampling, but again, they're just different examples of how you would take different real life scenarios where you would have different groups that you would want to randomly sample from within those versus doing a blanket random sample. The upshot that I would share with you is one of the most important questions to ask here is knowing at what level do we need to report out on this? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the leaders that are expecting information about this? Because a lot of times we're doing this in reporting. We're reporting something out. We're reporting data to different leaders. Do those leaders need that information? And also very clearly defining the population, getting down to an operational definition that's measurable will help us get to this point, whether we need strata. And then there might be other cases, special cases, where you might want to oversample. DE&I is a great example of that, where we might want to oversample groups that are underrepresented in the broader population because their voice is essentially what we're trying to understand and measure. So when that's the case, when that's the purpose, you might actually want to use stratified random sampling and oversample in some of those rare cases. Okay, couple of other examples that I want you to be familiar with. Convenient sampling. The name says it all. It's a sampling approach out of complete convenience. A great example of this would be, hey, we're doing a study, we're in the HR department, we're about to roll something out, but let's do a quick sample using all the people in the HR department who roll up to the CHRO because the CHRO is commissioning the study. And we have it won't cost us any money. We can go out, we can get some ideas. Is it going to be generalizable to the whole organization if we do that? Of course not. But what it can do is help us to answer some questions, help us to look at some of the initial data, to make some guesses about what we might see. We can start to question, okay, well, how representative is this sample? Is it not? So you will certainly get some sampling bias, but there could be some benefits with convenient sampling. Sometimes it's all you have. Sometimes it's not possible to do fully random sample or stratified random sample. So this is one of those tools that you use when you have to, but is not really an ideal tool, right? There might be some practical limitations of budget and access or time that you might have to do this, and this is all you can do. But really, this is only there for when you need it, really, right? It's not the tool that you use a lot. It's the tool you use. I need that wrench that I never use. Here it is because I have to this time. There's a couple of other examples here. We're not going to go through these because I want to get to the sample size. This is also some good examples of sampling to be familiar with, and they might actually be useful to you. Cluster sampling, you can kind of see some examples where and I haven't used cluster sampling all that often. You might use it when there's groups of employees that you can go to quite easily. To me, it's very similar to convenience sampling, but there are different groups of them that you can go to. Snowball sampling is actually one that I have used pretty often. The idea of a snowball sample is that you might get let's say I got access to all of you for a research study, right? You're in our class and, hey, class, guess what? I'm doing this research study. I'm going to send you a survey. And hey, by the way, give it to 3 friends. And so you send it to 3 friends. And the idea of the snowball, it builds over time. So this often you use this when there's oftentimes a really small group of people, or something you're studying has a very low base rate. A real life example is when I was an undergrad, I was doing a study on people who went through open adoption. And for those of you who don't know what open adoption is, I'm actually an adoptee. I was adopted when I was an infant, and it was an open adoption, meaning I knew who my biological parents were and I had a relationship with them. Well, there's not a ton of people who went through. Oh, that's cool, Marina. That's awesome. So there's not a ton of people who go through that open adoption. And so what I used was snowball sampling. I knew a few people who went through open adoption. I talked to them. And I said, hey, do you know anybody else? And of course, they knew a few other people. So I built a snowball sample. Was it completely representative? Absolutely not. But it's still a helpful sampling mechanism when it's a relatively hard to find population of people. And then you can see multi-stage sampling. This is essentially, you can see the example here. You might be studying educational outcomes, and you might first select, the school, and then within the school, you go down to a certain class, and then you go down to people that are within the class. So you're using essentially different level of strata to continually narrow down who the sample is going to be. So really, I want to close out this section before we move to sample size and play with this tool, because I think you'll like this part. But what I really want you to take away from this is really what we are aiming for in sampling is representativeness of the sample in most cases. Random sampling is a great way to do that. It gives everybody in the population the equal chance to be selected. Stratified random sampling is a great tool for practical purposes. And then when you have to use non-random sampling approaches, there's a couple of examples. Convenient sampling is probably the most common. Snowball sampling, cluster sampling, and multi-stage. You don't need to memorize all of these, but it is good to be aware that you have different approaches to use when you can't use a random approach. Okay, the last little exercise I'd like to go through is to look at a very, very practical tool that you can use today, you can use in your research moving forward, is to determine what sort of sample size do you need, right? So after you've determined the sampling approach you want, now you have to determine, well, how big of a sample do we need to feel good about it, to feel comfortable that we're getting enough people to be able to say, yeah, okay, well, we have a pretty good representative and it's a good size. So there is a tool here. If you can grab this hyperlink, I'll put it in the chat too. Let's see. It's not a hyperlink, it's just a. Okay, so I'll put that in there. So if you pop it up on your side, on a side window, this piece has a nice little article that accompanies it. You feel free to read it on your own time. But essentially what this is a nice little interactive tool that allows you to play around with different scenarios, and it spits out an ideal sample size. And so there's a few things that you'll have to do, and I'm going to jump into this right now so we can see it. There's a few little options that you have, and I'll explain a little bit of this. The first is what we call the confidence level. And what you notice is if you click on that little arrow, you basically got 3 options. This is essentially, and we're not going to go into all the details of this, we don't have time to cover all the statistical parts of it, but basically this is a measure of how confident do you want to be. And as you ramp this up, one thing you'll notice is, let's say, you see this population size of 10,000, everything's being equal. Watch what happens when I bump it up to 99%. Saw the sample size jumped up tremendously. So essentially what this is saying is, if you want to be really confident, 99% confident, for example, in the estimates that you're going to be calculating from the sample, you need a much bigger sample. If you drop it down to 90, you'll see what happens to the sample size drops down a little bit, right? But the reason why there's 90, 95, and 99 is these are by far the three most commonly used, what we're going to call alpha. Well, they're related to the alpha level that we're going to use in some inferential statistics later. And so essentially, the most common in organizational research, and I think this is probably the most important takeaway, is 95%. This is by far your most common. You might want to use 99 if you're doing some really high stakes work and the risks of making an error on it are very, very high and it could lead to death or a real injury. You might want to bump it up, but generally in organizational research, we stick to 95. The other thing you can play around with is the population size. Now, you don't need an exact number. Yeah, great point, Brittany. If medical science uses 99% often for their threshold. In organizational research, we usually use 95. If you have a really small population, for example, you might go to 90, but I almost never do that. I almost always use 95. The population size, you don't have to be exact here. You can be general. So let's say you have, okay, Amazon has 1.6 million employees, give or take. How many zeros do I need? I think that's right. Okay. Notice a couple of things though. Notice how the ideal sample size barely changed as I changed the size of the population, right? Let's take a bunch of these zeros off. Watch what happens. Not much change, right? So the population size, you can be the lesson here is you can be general. You don't have to be precise with this. If you have 20,000 people roughly, or if it's like 21,500, just put in 20,000 and it'll give you generally enough. You can be kind of rough with the population size. And then the margin of error, there's a lot of options here. My suggestion, keep it to 3, 4, or 5. That's very common. If you look at polling research, for example, you'll generally see things like ±2, ±3, ±5. That's basically what these mean. What this and the confidence level mean. They impact how much error we have in our estimates. And so generally I use 5, but I would say generally you can range it from 3 to 5. But watch what happens to the sample sizes if you move it to 3. All right. So when you play around with the confidence level and you want to reduce the margin of error, you want to be more exact, you want to increase the confidence level. In other words, you want to be more exact. The more exact you are, the higher that ideal sample size is going to go up. So generally speaking, in organizational research, I tend to use 95% confidence level, and I'll use somewhere between 3 and 5% margin of error, depending on how much money we have, how much time, and how much access to a sample we have. Chris, anything to add on this piece before we move on?
And I want to go so much deeper than we have time for in confidence level versus margin of error. They matter a lot, especially when you start to get into predictive stuff. Confidence intervals and things like that matter quite a bit. But no, not
I know this hurts, Chris. I know it hurts you.
We can have more conversations about it, I think, as we go forward, but you're not going to see this a ton in your day-to-day life in an HR department. You're going to see it when you're consuming science, or you're going to see it when you're working with a vendor who uses science, like a survey vendor or someone like that. And we will get a little bit more into how this looks in a paper, I'm sure, over the next couple of weeks. But understanding that is, to Dr. Ben's point, is important because it's often a litmus test. If you see one of these numbers that's really out of whack, like they're using 0.9 or they have an 8% margin of error or something like that, it tends to be an indicator of somebody who's trying to get a significant effect rather than someone who's trying to do science properly.
Yeah.
So as Dr. Ben
that's
said, one of the main things we're doing is trying to make you intelligent consumers of science and looking at these parameters that scientists are putting around their statistics can be a great red flag for knowing how serious someone is about the research that they're doing.
Yeah, that's a great heuristic, Chris. That's a really good point. Is now this can arm you with, if you see a very high margin of error reported, that you know, 10% margin of error, that's a high margin of error. And look at what happens to the ideal sample size, right? We have a group of 20,000. If we're using a 5%, which is fairly standard, this is a decently healthy sample size. This is typically what we would use in our work. We'll sometimes, when we want to be really sure, we'll go up to 3%. But yeah, if you start seeing stuff like this, that should give you some pause. Tyler, you have a question?
Yeah, so would that be listed in someone's research report? Like, how would you be able to obtain that, or is that going to be calling
Yeah.
up the person who actually did the research?
Yeah, if it's a good, if it's a uh generally legitimate researchers, one in an academic paper, you're gonna have enough you're gonna have enough data to replicate that study. If you look at, let's say, a vendor who's putting out research like Qualtrics or you know, one of our competitors, for example, they're going to put that information. They're going to tell you the sample size. They're going to tell you that the characteristics of the sample at a high level. They're going to tell you what the margin of error is. They're going to tell you that. What they're not going to say usually is they're not going to define the population clearly. That's almost never done. You have to kind of hunt for that sometimes. Or if it's an academic paper, they might. But they will often have the margin of error included. That's a good question though, Tyler. Like if you're consuming research and you don't see any of that, you don't see, well, who did you sample? How did you sample? What was the margin of error? If you don't see that, that should immediately raise a red flag.
And the fun thing about scientists is they love sharing their work, even though the popular media that's writing a clickbait article about the research is not as motivated to communicate the science. But if you can figure out which institute did the research and roughly when it was done, a little bit of Googling can usually get you to a researcher and an email address. And you can say, hey, I saw that they wrote a paper about such and such in Psychology Today, and it seems like it was you. Can I read the paper? Because oftentimes what you're reading in the media or you're reading in HBR or you're reading in Psychology Today is not actually the research article. It's 1 or 2 or even 3 degrees removed from the primary research.
Exactly.
But it's not hard to Google your way back to that person, and they'll probably have a phone call with you if you're interested, right? Like they are
They'd be
very
thrilled
motivated.
that you read their stuff.
Yeah, they're amped. So you can usually get back to a pretty decent review of what actually happened, if you're motivated to find it.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Multi-stage, maybe then it's like multi-stage sampling. All right, cool. So that covers the bulk of what we wanted to do. I would certainly encourage you. There's actually going to be I think there's going to be a scenario in in the study guide that's going to have you actually run. It's either, I don't know if it's tomorrow or it's next week, but in the next 1 or 2 classes, there'll be a scenario where you actually get to play with that tool. But I would encourage you to use it. Start using it. Becca brought up a good point. Like you can actually go back and look at studies retroactively. And oh, sure, slide 9. Yeah. This one, Tyler? Is that the one you were talking about? Yeah, but you can retroactively go back, use that tool, play around with the tool, play around with what happens when you adjust the margin of error, when you adjust the population size. Notice what happens. Margin of error, confidence level have a huge impact on the sample size needed. The population size doesn't, unless you get to really small populations. And so that's where things like oversampling might come in. If you have a department, you're doing stratify random sampling, and you have a department with a super small team. We did this one time with one of our customers had the HR department. They only had 85 people in it. So we sampled everybody versus some of their field operations groups had thousands and thousands of people. So we only sampled a small percentage of them because that's all we needed with the money. Oh, sorry, 7. Yeah. This one? Okay, cool. Perfect.
Hey,
All right.
Ben,
Yeah. I know we're at time.
I'm transitioning to tomorrow's stuff. Is that okay?
Yes, please do.
Okay. I was gonna ask, do we have time set aside to talk a little bit about challenges or questions about the writing assignment?
We do. I think that is, let me just double check.
I'm pretty sure we do. I'm saying it out loud because I want all of you to think about, hey, I really hope you've broken ground on your paper. Which means you should maybe have some questions or some things you've run into. I think you all should talk amongst yourselves about it. That's the first best way to combat some of this. The second is to bring thoughts and questions tomorrow about it. Because I know it's a lot to bite off and chew and get through. And so that's why we have a little time for tomorrow. But I wanted to say it out loud so that you guys are thinking about where you at in your paper, what questions did you have, can you resolve it yourself or with your cohort? And if not, bring it to us tomorrow.
Yeah, great plug, because we do have, we had some significant time on the front end to talk, just have an open discussion about a few things. And so we can carve out a significant amount of time tomorrow for those types of questions. Because we're going to be mostly working through some vignettes. So with that
Yeah,
said,
and unlike the vignettes and the data manipulation exercise, Ben and I aren't going to be able to answer questions about the paper really because they're much bigger, meatier kinds of things. So the help you get from us is mostly going to be tomorrow.
yep. And then for tomorrow, this is basically what we have. It's a pretty light reading. You'll be introduced to some different types of data that we'll talk briefly about tomorrow. Data that you can collect. There's a short video I'm excited for you to see and discuss briefly. We could talk about the paper tomorrow. And then, of course, continue your progress on that, participate in the discussion board. And then, yeah, I think that's it. Okay. Any thoughts, any closing thoughts before we close out tonight? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Sorry for going a couple of minutes late, but thank you for the great discussions today. Hope you found this useful, and we'll see you back tomorrow. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys. See you tomorrow.
Bye. Have a good night.
Good night.
All right, nobody hanging around.